The laughter hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. My hand hovered over the plate, knuckles whitening, as my elder brother John leaned back in his chair with that smug tilt he always carried. And don't forget the charity gala fiasco last month. Classic move, huh? His voice had that casual cruelty that disguised a lifetime of superiority. Around the table, a ripple of giggles spread like wildfire. Each one landed on me, small but sharp, igniting flashes of every minor humiliation I'd endured. Coffee spilled at Aunt Maria's brunch, that stumble at last Christmas gathering, the subtle comparisons my parents made every year between me and John. Every memory was a weight pressing down, but I refused to let it show. Across from me, my younger sister Lisa leaned forward, smirking with that effortless charm that had always masked her cruelty. "Honestly, you make it too easy sometimes," she said, voice honeyed but cutting. She thought she was harmless. She had always thought she could charm the world while quietly stabbing at me. I held my gaze steady, my fingers brushing the envelope I'd been holding for weeks, the one that carried more than just paper. Slowly, deliberately, I slid it across the polished table. No words, no theatrics. Just the crisp, thick envelope gliding into the center, its weight a promise. Their reactions came like a shockwave. John's fork wobbled in midair, Lisa froze mid-laugh, and my mother Margaret inhaled sharply, a hitch in her breath that made the crystal wine glass tremble. The sound of it nearly striking the table acted as punctuation to the sudden silence. Even my father, Harold, whose pride usually filled every corner of the room, leaned back, blinking as if he had been momentarily unmoored from reality. John's voice cracked. Is this a joke?" His confident mask, polished for decades, was already starting to fracture. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The envelope carried the weight of every slight, every whispered doubt, every moment they'd believed I was less than them. And the best part, they had no idea what hit them. I watched carefully. The panic bloomed in John's eyes like a slowly spreading stain. Lisa's practiced composure faltered. Her fingers twitched, betraying the calm she worked so hard to maintain. My mother's hands clenched around her napkin, tight enough that I could hear the faint crinkle. And my father's throat worked against the invisible lump that had caught there, a subtle tremor no one else could see but me. Every gesture, every micro-reaction confirmed I had chosen this moment perfectly. But it wasn't just about the present. As I watched, memories of years past stitched themselves into the moment, creating a tapestry of small humiliations and ignored potentials. John mocking my ideas in whispered gatherings, Lisa undermining every effort with a sweet smile, my parents quietly enforcing the unspoken rule that I was the safe one, the one whose failures entertained but never threatened. And now, with this single act, the scales began to tilt. The envelope didn't just contain money. It carried leverage, strategy, and a subtle reckoning. It was the culmination of every overlooked idea, every subtle betrayal, every moment they assumed I would stay small. And as I sat there, letting their panic ripple outward, a quiet satisfaction surged through me. Not arrogance, not gloating, just the calm recognition that the first move had been mine. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. I saw John's jaw tighten as he weighed his assumptions, Lisa's smile flicker and waver, my mother's gaze dart nervously, and my father's fingers twitch in silent uncertainty. Each of them was performing a mental calculus they didn't realize I had already anticipated. And still, I remained silent. The seed was planted, the first blood drawn, but this was only the beginning. The game had started, and they didn't even know the rules. Every glance, every twitch, every misstep they made from here on out would be a move in the board I had already laid. I leaned back slightly, eyes calm, posture perfect, letting the tension thrum through the room like a live wire. They were desperate for answers. They didn't know that the answers they sought would arrive on my terms, and that the envelope was only the first whisper of a reckoning that would echo far beyond this dinner table. Even as their stunned faces hovered over the $33 million check, my mind flickered backward, threading through the years that had built this moment. 8-year-old me sat at the same dining table, hair messy, hands trembling, while John beamed under every spotlight. Mother's smile was radiant, but reserved only for him. "Well, that's nice, dear," she had said to me, brushing aside my school project as if it barely existed. The sting hadn't dulled. It had only dug deeper, hiding behind every polite nod, every whispered comparison. Fast forward to last week, the gala disaster. Same table, same faces, but now the room was crowded with distant relatives and family friends. I stumbled under the subtle glare of expectation. Lisa's thin smile cut sharper than any words, and she leaned toward John, whispering, "See, some things never change." I forced a laugh, swallowing humiliation like bitter medicine, but the echoes of childhood sneers whispered louder than ever. Each slight, each comparison had become a ledger in my mind, silent, meticulous, unforgiving. I looked at John now. The tension in his jaw, the flush creeping up his neck, it mirrored the panic of a child caught in a misstep. I had memorized him. Every twitch, every instinctive flicker of pride or fear, I knew the rhythm of his confidence and the cracks beneath it. This wasn't just a check on the table. It was a trigger primed by years of observation. And Lisa, still wielding that manipulative charm, still able to make people laugh while her words cut like knives. Her eyes darted, hunting for a foothold, a way to spin dominance back in her favor. But she had miscalculated. She had underestimated more than my intelligence. My patience, my precision, my capacity to turn humiliation into calculated power. Even my parents weren't immune. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped her napkin, the tremor betraying a cocktail of pride, shock, and a subtle panic at losing control. Harold's hand hovered, a micro-expression betraying years of quiet dismissal, the strategic way he had always wanted me to fail safely, predictably. And now predictability was gone. Each flashback was fuel. I remembered signing away ideas that became John's triumphs, letting him bask in praise while I stayed the safe one. I remembered nights spent awake, studying, learning, observing, while the family hierarchy slept comfortably around me. Every slight, every whispered doubt had laid the tracks for this moment. The dinner room hummed with low-grade tension, the check a beacon of the present. But the past was the invisible blade slicing through their assumed superiority. Every glance, every flinch was a note in a symphony they didn't know was being conducted. The memory of being underestimated had transformed. It was no longer pain. It was precision, and I held it all back. Every slight, every humiliation, every childhood injustice was a breadcrumb leading them into a trap they wouldn't see snap shut until it was too late. The first move had landed. The real game, the one that would unravel their control, their confidence, their hierarchy, was only just beginning. By the time I reached adulthood, the pattern had become painfully clear. John thrived on visibility, on applause, on being the one everyone turned toward. Lisa thrived on influence, bending people without ever raising her voice. And me. I had mastered the quiet art of survival, watching angles no one else noticed, calculating moves in a world that constantly underestimated me. It was during what should have been a routine family gathering that the betrayal struck. The kind that doesn't announce itself with a bang, that doesn't make a scene, but quietly rearranges the landscape of your life. I pitched an idea, small, deliberate, something that could have grown under attention. On the surface, they listened politely. No laughter, no outright mockery. The cleverness of this betrayal was in its invisibility. John had already maneuvered behind the curtain. My proposal, my months of designs, calculations, strategies, was quietly transferred into his name. A combination of legal loopholes, private agreements, and careful timing made it seamless. Lisa, ever subtle, had nudged our parents to approve, framing it as a family-friendly adjustment, a gesture meant to prevent conflict. I nodded politely, thanking them for their guidance, concealing the dagger lodged in my own chest. Weeks later, the idea launched under John's banner. The world cheered, praise poured in, articles called him a visionary, social media buzzed with admiration for his creativity. And me, I was invisible again. But not the harmless kind. I was watching, calculating, logging every misstep, every hint of overconfidence, every smug grin and subtle gloat. The betrayal didn't hurt because it was unfair. It stung because it was brilliant, surgical. Invisible, perfect. And in that sting I found clarity. Revenge had to mirror the intelligence of the slight. It couldn't be loud, it couldn't be obvious, it couldn't come from emotion. It had to be invisible until the moment it landed, undeniable, undeniable in its precision. Every glance John gave to the press, every pat on the back, every whisper of praise was catalogued. Every move Lisa made to charm, to manipulate, to appear untouchable was data. They had no idea that their cleverness, their careful orchestration, had actually handed me the blueprint for undoing them. By the time the $33 million check appeared at that dinner, this betrayal had been the spark. It ignited years of meticulous planning. Childhood humiliation, adult dismissal, subtle underestimations, they had all fed the strategy. John and Lisa believed themselves untouchable, perched atop a throne of superiority. They didn't know they had stepped onto my chessboard and that every piece they moved had already been predicted. And when it finally dawned on them that they had been outmaneuvered, that the invisible hand they never noticed was about to strike, the impact would be far more devastating than any sum of money could convey. After John and Lisa's betrayal, I didn't erupt in anger. I didn't confront them. I disappeared not visibly but strategically. The family assumed I had been sidelined, that I lacked talent, drive, or intellect. That assumption became my weapon. While they flaunted the success they had stolen, I retreated into silence, watching, learning, and preparing. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle misstep by them was catalogued. Nights stretched long and quiet. I immersed myself in contracts, financial statements, and market trends, pages and graphs that they had never bothered to read. I taught myself the mechanics of investments, intellectual property, and corporate strategy. Patience became instinct, a steady pulse that could wait years without anyone noticing, waiting for the exact moment when precision would matter more than brute force. Every humiliation, every whispered comparison, every cute little failure, every scoff at family events was now fuel for methodical planning. Family gatherings became my study halls. John stumbled over decisions he assumed I wouldn't notice. Lisa, ever the manipulator, nudged friends and relatives into her orbit, convinced no one was watching her subtle moves. But I was watching. I logged every pause, every laugh, every micro-expression. Every seemingly insignificant gesture was intelligence, a thread in a web I was quietly weaving. The $33 million fortune didn't arrive by luck. It wasn't sudden. It was the product of silent, meticulous maneuvering. That patent John had mocked, secured, the investment Lisa dismissed as trivial, captured. Every opportunity, every oversight they allowed in their arrogance, I quietly seized. They were blind to the foundation being built beneath their feet. I never announced my presence. I never claimed credit, not even in thought. Instead, I weaponized invisibility. Each insult, each joke at my expense sharpened my focus. I watched them celebrating imagined victories, proud of their presumed supremacy, completely unaware that I was already several moves ahead. Even the tiniest cracks in their composure became data. A whispered worry about debt here, a hesitant glance there. Every flinch, every boast, every calculated smile from Lisa, every forced laugh from John, it all fed the architecture of my plan. I was building an invisible fortress, piece by piece, while they indulged in overconfidence. By the time I returned to the dinner room, the $33 million check was not just a number. It was the first visible strike in a war that had been brewing for years. The battle was never about wealth. It was about control, recognition, and the irreversible shift of power. And while they celebrated themselves as untouchable, I had already claimed the real advantage. Patience, strategy, and the quiet knowledge that the game was mine, and they had no idea how it would end. The invitation seemed ordinary, the kind of family gathering I had endured for decades, but I knew better. Harold, my father, had fallen ill, a minor scare to outsiders, but enough to summon the entire family under one roof. The house felt different the moment I stepped inside. Smiles stretched thin, laughter trembling, energy taut with unspoken tension. John moved with stiff confidence, jaw tight, eyes flicking nervously. Lisa glided through the room like a diplomat in control, but every so often her gaze betrayed calculation, flicking toward me as if weighing the threat I posed. As the evening unfolded, cracks began to surface. John stumbled through a routine business proposal, fumbling over numbers he once boasted he had mastered. Lisa jumped in, twisting sentences to salvage his credibility, but each effort only spotlighted her own missteps. Even my parents, masters of control and pride, betrayed subtle panic. Whispered mentions of debts, quiet concern over social standing, micro gestures of unease in front of distant relatives. The carefully polished veneer of their dominance was cracking. I observed it all. Every hesitation, every forced laugh, every glance heavy with hidden calculation was logged. My goal wasn't just to be right. It was to understand the exact fragility of their confidence. Every hint of weakness, every moment of self-doubt became a lever I could pull in the future. Then, a quiet trigger. John leaned toward me, voice casual but edged with presumption. "You've grown some savings, right?" he asked, almost sheepishly. The subtext was unmistakable. He assumed I was still modest, harmless, invisible. Lisa sipped her wine, masking the same calculation behind practiced elegance. Neither of them had an inkling. They didn't know I wasn't just prepared. I had been quietly amassing power, knowledge, strategy, leverage, while they were blind to it. Every word, every glance, every minor remark carried tension. The stakes were no longer financial alone. Reputation, dominance, family hierarchy, every thread of their lives was exposed to manipulation. Small slips became loaded triggers, minor miscalculations amplified into potential catastrophes. I cataloged them all, a silent observer constructing a map of vulnerability beneath their overconfidence. By the end of the evening, the shifts were undeniable. The timid, underestimated child they thought I was had vanished. In my place stood a measured, calculating presence. Every stumble, every fleeting worry, every microflinch had confirmed a single, undeniable truth. The family they believed untouchable was fragile. And the cost of underestimating me, the reckoning I had been orchestrating in silence, was only just beginning. While the family fretted over Harold's health and whispered anxieties about business, reputation, and status, I held my secret like a living thing. To them, I was still the quiet one, the safe one, the child they never took seriously. But beneath that calm exterior, the $33 million had already been meticulously assembled. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was the product of every slight, every betrayal, every moment they assumed I was powerless. I had quietly reclaimed the idea John had stolen years ago. The very proposal he had maneuvered into his name, my months of careful strategy, had become the cornerstone of a leverage I alone had transformed. Through strategic partnerships, late-night research, and perfect timing, I had turned it into a multi-million-dollar acquisition, invisible to the public eye. Lisa's dismissals had given me freedom. John's arrogance had cleared the path. Every small victory they never noticed now compounded into a force they could neither see nor challenge. The poetic justice was exquisite. The $33 million originated from projects they had mocked, dismissed, or undermined. Every dollar a reminder that their arrogance had built the opportunity I had quietly seized. The irony was not lost on me, and the audience feels it too. The very people who had engineered my erasure had unknowingly created the foundation for my triumph. Tension flickered through the room like electricity. I overheard Lisa telling a family friend that I had modest savings, confirming my invisibility had been my advantage. John bragged about a minor business win, oblivious that the real fortune, the one that would shatter assumptions, was already in motion. Every micro-expression, every slight pause, every miscalculation they made was catalogued, stored, and reserved for the moment of impact. And yet I revealed nothing. I let them believe the hierarchy was intact. The $33 million was not a weapon to be brandished. It was a scalpel, surgical, precise, and lethal in timing. Every word, every gesture, every twitch in their presence became part of a choreography I had rehearsed over years of observation and patience. The tension was nearly tangible, vibrating between us like a charged wire. The audience now grasps the stakes. The fortune is immense, but the real power is psychological. The family does not yet understand that the seed of their humiliation has been planted and that when it blooms, it will consume them completely. By the end of this module, the stage is set. I have the $33 million. The family is vulnerable. The trap is in place. All that remains is timing, and timing, as they will soon discover, has always been in my hands. Night had settled like a held breath over the dining room, each family member circling the table as if a single bite might betray their composure. John smiled too broadly, forcing confidence over the tremor beneath. Lisa hovered like a poised predator, eyes flicking toward me with amusement that barely masked curiosity. Even my parents, Harold and Margaret, carried the tension in their bodies. Margaret's hand trembled as she poured wine, knuckles whitening around the glass stem, while Harold's throat tightened, his usual authority suspended by the weight of uncertainty. I let them speak first. The taunts arrived cloaked as casual banter. "You'll understand responsibility one day," John said, leaning forward, blind to the irony. Lisa smirked, adding, "We were just worried you might get overwhelmed with bigger projects." Each syllable was meant to humiliate. Each reminded me how long I had waited for this very moment. Calmly, I slid the envelope into the center of the table. No flourish, no announcement, just the quiet, deliberate motion of paper against polished wood. The effect was instantaneous. John's fork wobbled, clattering against his plate, eyes wide with disbelief. Lisa froze mid-laugh, hand hovering inches from her glass. Margaret gasped sharply, knuckles tightening against her napkin. Harold's fingers twitched before resting rigidly, as if his body had forgotten how to assert authority. John's voice cracked first, instinctively. "Is this a joke?" The words were empty. Panic had already taken root. Every micro-expression betrayed fear, disbelief, and the dawning realization that the quiet one, me, had not just caught up but outmaneuvered them completely. I watched them, cataloging every tiny flinch, every irregular breath, every subtle shift of posture. They scrambled without understanding why. And the irony was exquisite. Their arrogance, their years of presumed superiority, had blinded them to the one factor that now dominated the room. The $33 million check was not just money. It was leverage, proof, and a mirror, reflecting the full scope of their misjudgment. Lisa's eyes locked on mine, hunting for any crack, any trace of vulnerability. John's jaw tightened as he recalculated his world in real time, trying to locate his footing. My parents, the architects of my supposed inadequacy, were silent, the gravity of their own expectations pressing down like stone. Every microflinch, every whispered, unguarded reaction confirmed a single undeniable truth. They had underestimated me, but I said nothing. No words, no justification, no gloating. Silence was my amplifier. The check spoke for me. The panic, the confusion, the sudden recalibration of dominance in their eyes, it was proof that my years of planning had succeeded. And the most exquisite part, this was only the beginning. The silence around the dinner table stretched like a live wire, tense, electric, and heavy. But it was not my tension that filled the room, it was theirs. John's confident mask had cracked, replaced by twitching awareness that the room no longer obeyed his control. Lisa's practiced charm, that flawless armor she had worn for years, faltered with each micro-flinch, each subtle calculation she realized she had misread. Even my parents, Harold and Margaret, shifted uneasily, their authority diminished in ways they could not articulate, the foundation of their control quietly eroding beneath their own eyes. Then the first domino fell, not because I struck it directly, but because I had orchestrated the setup with years of quiet precision. John had boasted about a small investment, trivial in his eyes, flaunting it as a personal triumph. What he didn't know, I had quietly reversed its terms through legal and financial maneuvers invisible to everyone but me. That same project, once a symbol of his dominance, began to unravel before our eyes. Minor errors spiraled. Misstatements on social media, miscalculations in filings, a trusted partner publicly questioning his judgment. Each mistake magnified in real time, invisible to them until the consequences became undeniable. Lisa attempted intervention, redirecting conversation to hypothetical social outcomes, trying to spin confidence back into the room. But her efforts only drew sharper attention to her miscalculation. In every word she spoke, every gesture intended to cover cracks highlighted her failure to anticipate my patience and foresight. I observed it all, savoring the subtle victories. The quiver in her forced smile, the tense tightening of her fingers around the stem of her wine glass. The $33 million check was no longer just currency. It had become a lens, magnifying every failure, every misstep, every assumption they had made about me. Reputation, credibility, social dominance, all hung by threads they had believed unbreakable. Even my parents, once masters of perception, could not hide the shock in their eyes. This was no longer about money. It was about power slipping out of their grasp, visibility they could no longer command, control they could not reclaim. I said nothing. I let them squirm in quiet panic, the slow burn of realization hitting every one of them in waves. Each microflinch, each recalculated smile, each subtle attempt at regaining composure confirmed the truth. The years of underestimation had come full circle. The audience feels it. This is psychological warfare at its most elegant, a masterclass in patience, leverage, and silent domination. By the end of the evening, it was undeniable. The golden child schemes were unraveling, the manipulative sibling's charm had faltered, and my parents' authority had been quietly eclipsed. And through it all, I remained the calm epicenter, the orchestrator, the one they had always overlooked until now. The morning after the dinner, the house felt like a fragile crystal waiting to shatter. John moved through the rooms with a tense, deliberate precision, as if every glance from a family member might expose the truth he was desperate to ignore. The effortless confidence that had always radiated from him now flickered with uncertainty. Emails meant for routine business decisions were drafted, reread, and resent multiple times, each iteration laced with hesitation. Even familiar tasks, pouring coffee, answering a phone call, greeting a cousin, felt precarious under the invisible weight of exposure. Lisa's edges frayed as well. The social web she had spent years weaving her charm, influence, and manipulative grace began to unravel thread by thread. Subtle attempts to reclaim control were met with suspicion. Allies hesitated, unsure whether loyalty to her was genuine or simply a facade. She whispered, maneuvered, plotted, but every move only underscored mistakes I had predicted years ago. Her elegance no longer masked the panic beneath. I remained in the background, a quiet force neither boasting nor gloating. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. John's fragile confidence, Lisa's crumbling armor, and my parents' carefully curated authority collided with a single, undeniable truth. They had underestimated me for decades. Every choice they now made felt weighed against an adversary who had been invisible, patient, and precise. Private confrontations unfolded behind closed doors and in hushed corridors. John accused desperation, sharpening every word. Lisa tried to manipulate, her charm failing to cover the tremor in her voice. Even my parents wrestled with disbelief, guilt flickering across their faces. "You knew all along," John's voice sliced through the quiet like glass, raw with frustration. I let him stew, let him confront the immensity of his misjudgment. Each accusation, each attempt at reasoning, only magnified the depth of his unraveling. It became clear in those private, tense moments that the $33 million was more than currency. It was proof, leverage, and psychological mastery distilled into a single act. Every insult, every dismissal, every childhood slight they had orchestrated had now been repurposed into a tool of quiet dismantling. Their carefully constructed lives, built on the presumption of my weakness, were collapsing beneath them like sand through fingers. By the end of the day, John moved cautiously, every decision tentative. Lisa's smile faltered, replaced with forced composure. My parents were silent, uneasy in ways they could not articulate. The household vibrated with subtle panic, tension threading through every room. The stakes were no longer financial. They were reputational, emotional, and psychological. And through it all, I remained steady, observing every flinch, every tremor, every whispered doubt. The psychological war was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The quiet one was no longer invisible. Late evening had draped the house in quiet shadows. The family had dispersed, buzzing with speculation, but here in the study, under the soft halo of a desk lamp, there was only truth, only the weight of decades pressing between us. Harold's hands, once steady and commanding, trembled slightly as he clasped them together. The man who had quietly defined me as dumb for years, who had celebrated John's brilliance and Lisa's manipulations while I remained the safe one, now faced a reckoning he had never imagined. Why didn't you tell us? His voice was strained, fragile eyes darting away from mine. It wasn't curiosity, it was disbelief edged with fear. He had assumed I lacked the tools, the patience, the audacity to surpass not just him, but John, Lisa, the entire family hierarchy. And yet here I stood, calm, controlled, the architect of consequences he had never anticipated. I said nothing at first. Silence stretched, thick and deliberate, forcing him to confront the tension on his own terms. Finally I spoke, each word measured, sharp as a scalpel. You didn't underestimate me, you needed me to stay small. The room seemed to shrink. The words struck like glass shattering, fracturing decades of assumed dominance. Harold's micro-expressions, tightened jaw, widened eyes, a hitch in his breath, spoke more than any apology could. He understood in an instant that my compliance, my quietness, my so-called limitations had never been accidental. They had been the scaffold upon which he and the family had built their assumptions, their arrogance, their sense of control. Flashbacks rushed unbidden, dinners where my ideas were stolen, Lisa whispering while she plotted, Harold smiling at John's triumphs. Each memory honed the weight of the moment, yet anger did not rise. Instead, I felt the calm inevitability of precision, a lifetime of patience culminating in this exact reckoning. You taught me, I continued, voice steady, that my voice didn't matter, that my actions were insignificant. Every lesson, every dismissal prepared me for this moment. I gestured toward the rest of the house, toward the family unknowingly unraveling under their own misjudgments. You thought keeping me small was a limit, it was preparation. Harold swallowed hard, a flicker of guilt, awe, and fear crossing his face. I didn't need recognition, I didn't need apologies. The point was clarity, the undeniable shift in power. The rules that once governed me no longer applied. He felt it in a way no lecture, no reprimand, no demonstration of authority could undo. The silence lingered, thick, charged, stretching between us like an electric current. Words had lost meaning. I had spoken the truth, the rest, the slow, inevitable collapse of assumptions, the quiet dismantling of those who had underestimated me, was now in motion. Power had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time he felt it with the undeniable weight it carried. The house had changed, though no one dared acknowledge it openly. Meals were quieter, conversation measured, laughter cautious, every sound carrying the weight of fear, uncertainty, and unspoken calculation. John avoided direct eye contact. his once commanding presence now tempered by the shadow of exposure, his confidence fractured by the invisible yet undeniable consequences of misjudgment. Lisa, elegant, poised, and still radiating charm, moved through rooms like a dancer on glass, careful, deliberate. But every small misstep betrayed the tension coiled beneath her practiced grace. Even Harold and Margaret, architects of the family hierarchy for decades, now hesitated before speaking, each word weighed, measured, and filtered through the lens of their own vulnerability. I observed them all, outwardly calm, inwardly aware of the irreversible shift. The $33 million, the strategic reversals, the meticulous dismantling of their assumptions, all had silently rewritten the rules. Yet I did not gloat. I allowed them to stew in the uncertainty, to live in the shadow of my quiet dominance. Every glance they stole, every cautious gesture reminded them and the audience that I had claimed a new authority, one that existed beyond money or words. Presence itself had become leverage. Dominance, I knew, was never static. That's why I left traces of ambiguity in every interaction, a fleeting smirk here, a brief glance there, an unspoken question about loyalty or trust. They could not predict my next move. Would I forgive? Would I act again? Would I extend influence or let the house's fragile equilibrium collapse further? The $33 million had become more than wealth. It was a symbol, a tangible measure of patience, strategy, and control so quiet it felt invisible until it struck. I walked through the house that evening, letting the silence settle like a thick curtain. The family had survived the storm, but the storm had rewritten everything. Every misjudgment, every underestimation, every assumption they had made about me had been exposed and neutralized. Yet there was no closure, no definitive victory to savor. Only the hum of latent tension, the knowledge that the safe one could no longer be ignored. The final image lingered in the mind. A household changed, fragile, alert, and a protagonist whose decades of silent strategy had reached perfection. The question remained, what would come next? And the answer, deliberately withheld, left the audience suspended in that precise electric space between fear, awe, and curiosity, unable to look away. Subscribe to my channel for more stories like this.